Maria was lying in a hospital bed in Seattle when she told a social worker about the shoe. It was 1977. The ward at Harborview Medical Center carried the particular sounds of a large public hospital, the soft percussion of footsteps on linoleum, the low murmur of voices at a nurse's station somewhere down the corridor, the occasional mechanical breath of equipment in adjacent rooms. Gray light came through the window, the kind of gray that belongs specifically to the Pacific Northwest, in the way fog belongs to certain coastlines. Not oppressive, simply present, a quality of the air rather than an absence of sun. Maria had been resuscitated from a severe cardiac arrest. She was alive, and she was describing something she said she had seen while she was not. The social worker's name was Kimberly Clark Sharp. She had come to Maria's room in the ordinary course of her work at the hospital to speak with a patient who had no established local address, no family in Seattle, no network of people to check on her in the days after her admission. Sharp settled into a chair beside the bed. She had heard unusual accounts from patients before, the way anyone working in a hospital for enough years eventually does. What Maria described, quietly and with some care, was that she had left her body. Maria said she had floated above herself. She described looking down at the medical personnel working around her during the cardiac arrest, their positions, their movements, the particular angle of her own body on the bed below. She said she had continued upward and outward, drifting through the building's walls entirely into the open air above and around the Harborview structure. This is what patients who have undergone resuscitation sometimes report, and Sharp was not entirely unfamiliar with the category of account. What made Maria's report different? What separated it from the kind of account that was received politely and filed away without further follow-up was a single specific detail she offered before she was finished. She had seen a shoe. It was on a ledge on the north face of the building. 3rd floor. A left shoe, she said, dark in color. She described a worn patch on the outer edge of the toe area, over the little toe, where the material had thinned from repeated contact. She described the lace, specifically one lace, tucked beneath the heel of the shoe, rather than tied. The shoe was alone on the ledge, not a pair, not placed there with any apparent intention, simply resting, as objects sometimes come to rest on the exterior surfaces of large buildings over time, accumulating there without anyone particularly noticing. Sharp listened. She noted the details. Then she went to find out if there was a shoe. The Harborview Medical Center building, as it stood on First Hill in Seattle in 1977, was a large institutional structure in the way that mid-century public hospitals tend to be. Substantial, functional, its exterior marked by the horizontal architectural protrusions that ran along its facade at each floor level, too narrow to serve any practical purpose. They're primarily as a consequence of the building's structural and stylistic language. These ledges accumulated, what ledges on tall buildings accumulate, the occasional wind-blown object, weather residue, the quiet debris of years. No one looked at them regularly. There was no reason to. Sharp went to the north side of the building and found a 3rd-floor window. She pressed her face against the glass. The ledge was narrow, not wide enough to stand on, not accessible by any ordinary route, no staircase leading to it, no fire escape opening onto it from that face of the building, no window situated in such a way that a person lying in a hospital bed could simply glance outward and see what was resting there. Sharp had to press close to the glass and angle her gaze outward and slightly downward to bring the ledge into view at all. It took a deliberate effort to locate it from inside the building. The shoe was there. It matched what Maria had described. Dark, left-footed, a worn area over the little toe on the outer edge. one lace tucked under the heel. Sharp documented what she found. The shoe was on the ledge. Maria had described it. Maria had been in her bed, recently resuscitated from a cardiac arrest, at the time she offered the description. That is the case. Those are the facts of it, as they have been documented and published. Nothing in what follows requires that a particular interpretation be placed on them. The shoe was on the ledge. Maria described it. The match between her description and the physical object was specific enough that Sharp judged it worth pursuing and later worth publishing. What the match means, whether it means anything beyond the match itself, whether it points towards something or simply happened, is a question the case leaves open in the way that a window left unlatched on a still night is open, quietly, without urgency, letting in whatever the air outside happens to carry. The ledge itself is worth holding in mind for a moment, a narrow strip of concrete running along the north face of a large hospital building on a hill above downtown Seattle. Third floor, 30 feet or so above street level. Visible from outside the building if a person on the street below craned their neck at the right angle, but not easily, not the kind of thing that naturally drew the eye from below. Visible from inside the building only if a person pressed their face against a specific window and looked at a specific angle, not visible at all from the corridor or from the general sight lines available to a person lying in a hospital bed on that floor. The ledge was there in the way that many exterior features of large institutional buildings are there, structurally present, architecturally routine, entirely unremarked upon. At some point before Sharp went to look, the shoe had arrived on it. How it arrived is not part of the documented record. A shoe on a ledge 30 feet above street level has arrived there by some means, dropped from above, placed there deliberately, blown by wind from a window that was open at an earlier time, but none of these origins was established, and the question of how the shoe came to be there is separate from the question of how Maria knew it was there. Both questions are open. Only one of them has been the focus of serious sustained attention. The worn patch on the little toe area of the shoe is the kind of detail that accumulates over time and is easy to overlook. A shoe that has been worn regularly by a person whose foot falls in a particular way develops its specific pattern of stress and wear over months of use. The outer edge of the little toe presses against the material at the same point with each step, and the fabric or leather at that point gradually thins, darkens slightly, develops a texture different from the surrounding material. It is not a dramatic mark. It is the kind of thing visible to anyone who looked carefully at that part of the shoe, and invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. It is also the kind of detail that would be visible from a particular angle, from the level of the ledge itself, looking at the shoe from outside the building, the worn toe area facing outward, and not easily visible from other angles, depending on how the shoe was positioned. The lace tucked under the heel is a different kind of detail. A loose lace does not naturally tuck itself beneath a heel. It might trail to one side or drape over the ledge, or lie in whatever position it occupied when the shoe came to rest in that place. A lace tucked under the heel suggests a specific final position, a specific orientation of the shoe on the ledge that a person describing the shoe from memory would need to have observed from close enough and from the right angle to report accurately. Maria's description placed the tucked lace in the position. Sharp found it. That correspondence is the center of the case, not the shoe itself, which is unremarkable, but the specific small facts of how the shoe was resting, and the question of how those facts were available to Maria. Sharp published her account of the case years after the events themselves. The specific details she documented, the worn little toe patch, the tucked lace, the left shoe, the dark color, the north face of the building, the third floor, appear in her written account as she remembered and recorded them, and that account became the primary source material for subsequent discussions of the case. The documentation is Sharp's. Maria had left Seattle by the time the account entered wider circulation. The case, as a documented object, belongs to the record Sharp created from what she witnessed and what she found. There is a quality to cases that resist easy explanation that has to do with their specificity. A vague account of floating and drifting during unconsciousness is interesting in the way that many such accounts are interesting, but it does not present a testable claim. It describes an experience without anchoring that experience in something verifiable. Maria's account did not stay vague. It arrived at a particular ledge on a particular face of a particular building and described a particular object resting there in a particular way. That specificity is what made the case worth following. Whether it is also what the case ultimately establishes is the question that has followed it ever since. The institutional sounds of the ward would have been continuous while Maria and Sharp spoke. A large public hospital in 1977 was not a quiet place, even in a private room, even when the corridor outside was relatively still. The ambient sound of mechanical equipment, the low voices of staff moving through their shifts, the occasional announcement over the ward's internal communication system, all of this would have formed the background against which Maria's words arrived. Sharp was listening. She was a social worker with professional training in how to take in what patients reported, how to hold an account without immediately categorizing it or dismissing it, how to stay with what was being said long enough to understand what was actually being communicated. What was being communicated was precise enough to act on. The gray Pacific Northwest light through the hospital window in 1977 was the same light that fell on the north face of the building, on the narrow ledge, on the dark tennis shoe resting there. The same diffuse, consistent, overcast light that illuminated everything at the same steady level, without shadow or glare. If the shoe's worn toe patch was facing outward, as Maria described, that patch would have been visible in that light to anyone positioned at the right angle, which is to say, to anyone floating at approximately the level of the ledge on the exterior of the building's north face, looking inward and slightly downward toward the shoe. That is the vantage point Maria's account implies. It is the vantage point from which the specific details she reported would have been most clearly legible. The Harborview Medical Center building rose on First Hill above the downtown streets of Seattle, its upper floors looking out over the city's terrain of hills and waterways toward the waters of Puget Sound to the west. From the interior of the building, the north-facing windows looked out over a portion of Seattle's First Hill neighborhood, rooftops, the upper floors of other institutional buildings, the sky above them. From the exterior of the building's north face, the ledge at the third floor would have been a strip of concrete running along the facade, accessible from no obvious point, holding whatever had come to rest on it over however long it had been there. The building itself was in the ordinary business of being a large urban hospital, patients arriving, patients recovering, staff moving through their shifts, the institutional life of a public medical center continuing without particular regard for what rested unobserved on its exterior surfaces. Maria was a migrant worker. She had arrived in Seattle without a local address, without a local medical history, without the established relationships with specific physicians or clinics that might have connected her to the city's medical system in an ordinary way. She had arrived in the city and then had a cardiac arrest, and she had been brought to Harborview, the hospital most likely to receive her, the public institution that served the patients, the private system did not. She was in a hospital bed in a city that was not yet home. Sharp came to her room as a social worker, which is to say, as someone whose professional purpose was to address the needs that medicine alone did not address: the housing, the connection, the human context of a patient who had no immediate network of support around her. It was in that professional context that Sharp settled into the chair beside the bed and listened to what Maria described. The specificity of Maria's account: the left shoe, the dark color, the worn little toe, the tucked lace, is worth returning to, because specificity is what makes a claim either testable or not. A person who reports floating during unconsciousness and describes a general sense of being above their body is reporting something that cannot be verified or contradicted. A person who reports floating and then names the color and condition of an object on an exterior ledge of the building in a location not visible from any ordinary interior vantage point is reporting something that can be checked. Sharp checked it. The shoe was there. The details matched. What the match establishes and what it does not are questions that subsequent researchers and critics have worked over carefully and at length. Whether the description was specific enough to be genuinely probative, whether a worn toe and a tucked lace in a dark tennis shoe are details distinctive enough to rule out coincidence, is a question that goes to the nature of the case's evidential weight. Whether Maria could have seen the shoe through an ordinary conscious moment at some earlier point, glimpsing it through a window before her cardiac arrest, is a question that cannot be answered with confidence, given the absence of documentation of her movements and condition before the arrest. Whether the information could have reached her through some conversational channel, someone mentioning the shoe in her presence without either party registering it as significant, is a possibility that cannot be ruled out and cannot be confirmed. These are the proper questions to bring to the case. They are also questions the case was never designed to answer, because it was never designed at all. It simply happened, or it was reported, and the shoe was on the ledge, Sharp's face pressed against the third-floor window glass, angling her line of sight outward and slightly downward, searching for an object she had been told was there by a woman who had been unconscious. That image is one way to hold what the case actually looked like in the moment of its verification. Not a dramatic discovery in the sense of a sudden revelation, but a careful, deliberate act of looking, made by a person who was not entirely sure what she would find, in a specific location, in a large institutional building, on a hill, in a Pacific Northwest city, on a gray afternoon in 1977. The window was there. The ledge was there. The shoe was there. Sharp looked, and she found what Maria had told her was there to find. The sound of the hospital ward, the gray light through the window, the narrow concrete ledge on the north face of the building, the single dark shoe resting on it. These are the elements of the case in their most precise form. Nothing about them requires elaboration into significance. The significance, if it is there, is already in the facts. A woman described an object she should not have been able to see. The object was there as she described it. The case does not go further than that. It simply arrives at that point and rests. A cardiac arrest in 1977 was a medical emergency managed with the tools and knowledge available in that period: defibrillation, chest compressions, the established resuscitation protocols of the late 1970s. Harborview's status as the region's primary public trauma center meant that its emergency and critical care staff were experienced in managing severe cardiac events. Maria's survival was a consequence of that medical response, the application of established clinical procedure to a body that had stopped and was brought back. The period during which she was unconscious, during which her heart was not working, and her brain was not receiving adequate blood flow, was the period she described as the time she was above her body. That correlation, the cardiac arrest, and the floating, is not incidental to the case. It is its structure. The north face of the Harborview building in 1977, in the gray Pacific Northwest light, with its narrow ledges running along the exterior at each floor, was not a remarkable piece of architecture. It was a large public building in an American city, built to function rather than to be noticed, its exterior surfaces doing the work of keeping the weather out and holding the structure together. The ledges were there because large mid-century institutional buildings often had such ledges, horizontal breaks in the facade, a small overhang at each floor, a feature of the building's style and structural approach rather than a designed feature in any practical sense. They were not maintained. No one climbed onto them, no one looked at them from inside the building unless they pressed their face to the glass of a window and specifically sought the angle that would bring the ledge below into view. Maria's description placed the shoe on the ledge at a level and in a position that Sharp was able to locate by doing exactly that, pressing her face to the glass of a third-floor window on the north side of the building and looking at the specific angle that brought the narrow concrete surface into view. The shoe was where Maria said it would be. It was as Maria described it. Sharp documented that correspondence. The documentation became the case. The case is not large in the way that some unexplained events seem to carry a kind of largeness, an elaborate scenario, multiple witnesses, official investigations, government records, a sequence of events extending over months or years. This case is small, a woman in a hospital bed, a social worker with a notepad, a narrow ledge on the outside of a building, a shoe. The smallness is part of what makes it persistent. There is nothing in it to dismiss except the central claim, and dismissing the central claim still leaves the shoe on the ledge, still leaves Sharp finding it where Maria said it would be, still leaves the question of how a woman who was unconscious knew its color and its condition and the position of its lace. The lace tucked under the heel of the shoe on the ledge, a detail so small it would be invisible to anyone not looking at that specific part of the shoe from a specific angle, was there when Sharp found the shoe. Maria had described it. The worn patch over the little toe on the outer edge of the left shoe was there when Sharp found it. Maria had described that too. Two specific physical details of a single unremarkable object on an exterior ledge of a large institutional building, described by a woman who had been lying in a hospital bed during a cardiac arrest, were found to correspond to the object when a social worker went to look for it. The correspondence is documented. The question the correspondence opens is not. The shoe had been on the ledge for some period before Sharp found it. How long is not established. It showed signs of wear. The toe patch had accumulated over time. The lace had come to rest in its tucked position at some earlier moment, which suggested it had not arrived there recently, but that is as far as the physical evidence takes the question of its origins. Before Sharp pressed her face to the window glass, before she confirmed what Maria had described, the shoe simply rested on the ledge in the gray exterior light of the building, unobserved and unattended, in the quiet air above the First Hill streets of Seattle. It was dark in color. Its worn toe patch faced outward. Its lace was tucked beneath the heel. It was there the way objects come to be on exterior ledges of large buildings, without ceremony, without witness, without any particular moment of arrival that anyone recorded or remarked upon. It had come to rest in that place and had remained there, accumulating the quiet passage of days or weeks, or however long it had been, while the city moved below it and the hospital carried on its life inside the building behind it. It was not significant, until Maria described it. It was not looked for until Sharp went looking. It was simply there, resting on the narrow concrete ledge in the gray Pacific Northwest light, the worn patch on its outer toe, the lace folded under the heel, the building's exterior surface cold and unattended around it. And then a woman in a hospital bed described it, and someone went to look, and it was exactly there. First Hill rises steeply from the streets below it, a long climb above the flat commercial grid of downtown Seattle, and from its upper reaches the city spreads west and south toward the water in a way that makes the surrounding geography legible all at once. Puget Sound lies to the west, wide and gray, its surface catching whatever light the sky permits. Elliott Bay curves in below the hill. The streets of downtown run in their compressed urban grid at the bottom of the slope, and then the hill begins, and the hill is steep enough that buildings on its lower edge look up at buildings on its upper edge, and the upper buildings look out over everything below them toward the Sound. Seattle, in 1977, was a city of approximately 490,000 people, built on terrain that made horizontal movement complicated and vertical movement constant. The hills were not incidental to the city's geography. They were structural to it, determining where streets ran, where neighborhoods formed, and which institutions occupied the high ground, with views across the water. First Hill had accumulated hospitals. The terrain that made it difficult to navigate by car or on foot had made it desirable for institutions that needed to remain fixed and accessible in all directions. And by 1977, the neighborhood was dense with medical buildings, their upper floors looking out over the rooftops of the downtown core below. Harborview Medical Center stood on the south slope of First Hill, and its position above the city was not incidental to its character. It was a public institution operated by King County, affiliated with the University of Washington, and it served the population of the city and the surrounding region without requiring the kind of prior relationship or financial arrangement that private hospitals required. It was the place a person came when they had no other place to go. It was the place emergency vehicles brought the critically ill, regardless of their insurance status, or their address, or the length of time they had been in the city. The building stood on its hill and received whoever needed receiving, and the city moved below it through its ordinary workday, while the hospital's interior ran on a different kind of time. The Pacific Northwest sky in a Seattle winter is not a dramatic sky. It does not produce the vivid overcast of coastal storms further north, or the theatrical clouding that rolls through mountain country. What it produces is a settled, consistent gray, a gray that arrives in October and remains through April, not threatening, not building toward anything, simply present and lowering and patient. The light that comes through it has a quality of diffusion, flat and even, that makes the city's colors look slightly muted, its surfaces slightly softened. Buildings on First Hill in December catch that light on their upper floors and their exterior ledges and accumulate it the way buildings in a gray climate always do, quietly, without distinction, the concrete growing a thin coat of urban weather over the years. It is worth sitting briefly with what that city was in 1977 and what circumstances had shaped it, because those circumstances are not merely background. They determined who was in Harborview Medical Center and why, and they determined the particular human texture of the hospital's patient population and the staff who moved through its wards, a texture that was specific to that city at that moment, shaped by the economic and industrial history of the decade that preceded it. The Boeing Company had been the dominant economic force in the Seattle metropolitan area for decades before 1977. The aerospace manufacturer employed tens of thousands of workers in the Puget Sound region and had been the engine of the city's prosperity through the post-war period and into the 1960s. Then, the contracts contracted, defense spending shifted, commercial aviation orders slowed. In the early 1970s, Boeing cut its Seattle workforce dramatically. The numbers varied by estimate, but the layoffs were substantial enough that a billboard appeared in the city that became famous enough to be remembered for years afterward. A sardonic message asking the last person leaving Seattle to turn out the lights. The billboard was a joke, but it named a real condition. The city's employment base had contracted sharply, and the effects of that contraction rippled outward through the decade and were still present in 1977 as secondary consequences: housing instability, population flux, the persistence of a mobile labor market in the Pacific Northwest that drew seasonal workers and agricultural laborers through the region on routes that followed harvests and construction cycles and available work. The agricultural regions east of the Cascades, the Yakima Valley, the Columbia Basin, the Wenatchee apple orchards, drew seasonal workers in large numbers through the growing and harvest seasons, and those workers moved in patterns that were not fixed to any single place. They followed the work, and when the work moved or ended, they moved with it. Some came back to Seattle between seasons. Some arrived in Seattle for the first time, having never planned to stay. The city was a point in a larger circuit rather than a destination, for a population whose relationship to place was defined by the availability of labor rather than by settled residence. A migrant worker arriving in Seattle in 1977 without a local address, without private insurance, and without an established relationship with a physician was not unusual. The city's public health infrastructure had been shaped in part by the consistent presence of this population, workers who needed care when they needed it, who had no regular doctor to call, who arrived at emergency rooms and public hospitals without a chart or a referral or a name in any system. Harborview was the institution that absorbed this population. As it absorbed every population, the city's private hospitals were less positioned to serve. The hospital's status as a Level 1 trauma center and its affiliation with the University of Washington Medical School meant that it maintained a high level of clinical capacity alongside its public service function, and the combination made it the destination not only for emergency cardiac cases among low-income patients, but for the region's most serious trauma, regardless of the patient's financial profile. A woman in cardiac arrest, newly arrived in the city, no local address, no insurance. This was not a patient profile that required explanation at Harborview. It was familiar. The hospital had seen it before and would see it again. The clinical machinery of the institution moved into its practiced response, and the woman was resuscitated, and she was placed in a bed, and the ordinary institutional life of the ward continued around her. The ward itself was the specific environment in which the events that followed would unfold, and it is worth holding that environment for a moment. The physical texture of it, the sounds and the light and the particular quality of institutional time that accumulates in a hospital ward in the late 1970s. These were not modern hospital rooms. They were rooms of a certain era, practical, not designed for comfort, lit with the fluorescent lighting that was standard in medical facilities of the period, smelling of antiseptic and the particular closed air quality of buildings that regulate their own atmosphere for clinical rather than human reasons. The sounds were the sounds of a working ward, the low conversation of nursing staff at the station, the occasional rolling of equipment down a corridor, the background hum of the building's ventilation system, the muted sounds of a city outside the windows that were themselves muted by the glass and by the altitude of the hill above the street. The windows on the north side of a third-floor ward at Harborview in 1977 looked out over the building's exterior face and beyond it toward the northern neighborhoods of the city. The ledges outside those windows were part of the building's architecture, concrete protrusions that served no particular function, too narrow to stand on, too high above the street to be easily observed from below, accumulating whatever the weather and the wind brought against the building's face over the years and then depositing there. Objects arrived on ledges like these by drift and chance and stayed because no one had reason to retrieve them. They were not visible from inside the building without pressing close to the glass and angling the gaze outward and downward along the building's exterior face. They existed in a narrow band of the building's geography that was neither interior nor fully exterior, a thin strip of concrete at the building's edge in the light that came down from the gray Pacific Northwest sky. The hospital's social work department was part of the clinical infrastructure of Harborview in the way that social work departments are always part of large public hospitals, not peripheral, but not the primary function either. Social workers moved through the wards speaking with patients who had no family present, patients who needed help navigating discharge logistics, patients who had experienced something during their hospitalization and needed someone to sit and listen. The institutional setting of that work was particular: small offices with metal desks and paper charts, the slow administrative pace of a department that ran on documentation and relationship rather than on emergency, the specific quality of attention that a skilled social worker brings to a bedside conversation with someone who has just been through something the clinical record cannot fully account for. Kimberly Clark Sharp was a social worker at Harborview Medical Center. The work of a hospital social worker in the late 1970s involved, among many other things, speaking with patients who reported unusual experiences during resuscitation, experiences that the medical staff noted in the chart without elaborating on them, that family members sometimes dismissed or gently redirected, that patients themselves sometimes offered haltingly, uncertain of how they would be received. A social worker was often the person in the institutional structure best positioned to receive these accounts, not because she held any particular medical or scientific authority over them, but because her role involved being present with a patient's experience in a way that the clinical encounter did not always allow. The cultural context around these accounts in 1977 had shifted significantly in the 2 years prior, in ways that were still settling into the broader public and professional consciousness. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, had arrived in bookstores in 1975, and it had done something that books in this territory rarely managed to do. It had found a mass readership. The term it introduced, near-death experience, had moved from the pages of a specialist text into the vocabulary of general cultural conversation. Millions of copies circulated. The book was discussed on television, in magazines, at dinner tables. The phenomenon it named, the consistent pattern of accounts from people who had come close to death or had been clinically dead and been resuscitated, was no longer a marginal curiosity. It had a name, and the name had reached a very large number of people. Whether the name had reached the clinical staff of Harborview Medical Center's cardiac wards in a way that changed how they received patient reports is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be said is that the formal documentation of unusual patient accounts in medical records at institutions like Harborview in 1977 remained inconsistent at best. The accounts were noted sometimes, passed on sometimes, and sometimes not recorded at all. The clinical record was a clinical record, It tracked vital signs, interventions, medications, outcomes. The patient's description of floating above the room was a different kind of information, and it did not always find a clear place in the institutional language of the chart. Seattle's journalism in 1977 was conducted through a small number of organizations working with the resources and methodological assumptions of mid-century American print and broadcast media. The Seattle Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer were the dominant newspapers, both maintaining the traditional structures of a mid-sized city's daily journalism: police reporters, city hall reporters, feature writers, editorial pages with local editorial positions. Television news was delivered through the local affiliates of the three major national networks, each operating with the limited resources of a local news operation in a city that was large, but not among the largest markets in the country. The news cycle was slower than it would later become. Stories that did not fit clearly into established categories: municipal government, crime, business, sports, required more effort to place in the paper, and stories involving unusual medical claims occupied an uncertain position in the editorial judgment of the mid-1970s newsroom. A patient in a Seattle hospital who reported an out-of-body experience during cardiac resuscitation was not in 1977 the kind of story that generated sustained investigative follow-up in the local media. Paranormal topics occupied a narrow band of the editorial spectrum: feature material, occasionally color pieces, filler for the weekend sections. The investigative resources required to examine a claim about patient perception during resuscitation, access to medical records, consultation with physicians and neurologists, a systematic evaluation of the evidentiary specifics, were resources that local journalism organizations of this period and scale did not routinely deploy on stories of this type. A story might appear and then not appear again. A claim might be noted and then allowed to drift from the editorial agenda without follow-up, absorbed by the daily demand for material about more legible civic subjects. This was not a failure of any particular newsroom. It was the condition of a specific kind of journalism at a specific moment, working within the limitations of its tools and its established categories and its available time. Stories that resisted those categories tended not to survive long in the editorial cycle, not because they were suppressed, but because the institutional machinery of the mid-sized daily newspaper in 1977 was not configured to carry them for long. The Pacific Northwest economy that shaped Seattle in the late 1970s was still working through the consequences of the Boeing contraction. The aerospace industry had been the city's dominant employer for so long that its reduction had produced effects well beyond the immediate loss of jobs, effects in housing markets, in the retail economy, in the secondary and tertiary businesses that had grown up around a large industrial workforce. By 1977, the most acute phase of the contraction had passed, and the city was in the early stages of the diversification that would eventually produce the Seattle of later decades, with its technology sector and its port trade and its service economy. But in 1977, those later developments were not yet legible. What was legible was the residue of a contraction, a city that was finding its footing, that was managing the persistence of unemployment and underemployment, that had a visible population of mobile workers for whom the city was a way station rather than a home. The seasonal agricultural labor economy of the Pacific Northwest operated on routes that the workers themselves knew well, and that the institutions serving them were less likely to know in detail. Harborview Medical Center was not in the business of tracking the seasonal patterns of migrant labor. It was in the business of receiving patients and treating them, and it received a population that included seasonal workers and migrant laborers as a consistent and unremarkable fraction of the people who came through its emergency department. The hospital's social work department was part of the institutional response to the particular needs of this population. Patients who might be discharged without a local address to return to, patients who might speak limited English, patients who might have no next of kin reachable by telephone, patients who needed the kind of coordination and advocacy that social work was specifically structured to provide. When a patient in this population had an unusual experience during resuscitation and described it to a social worker who was prepared to listen carefully and to document what she heard, the institutional conditions for that documentation were specific and not guaranteed. The social worker's attention was the instrument of documentation. There was no other mechanism reliably in place. The chart noted the clinical events. The social worker noted what the patient said. Whether that account entered any permanent record, how it was phrased, what details were retained, and what was lost in the process of transcription, all of these depended on the particular attention and the particular practices of the individuals involved. In a hospital room, on a specific day in 1977, the city outside the hospital window that day was going about its ordinary business. Traffic moved along the streets that ran up and down the hill. The gray Pacific Northwest light settled evenly across the building's exterior, across its ledges, across the narrow concrete protrusion running along the third-floor facade. The sound arrived through the glass as the muted urban sound of a mid-sized American city in the late morning or early afternoon of a winter day. Traffic, the occasional horn, the distant sound of construction somewhere on the hill, the ambient texture of a city that was working and moving and not paying attention to the upper ledges of any particular building. The ledges were not attended to. They were part of the building's architecture, present and functional, in the sense that architecture is always functional, whether or not it serves any particular purpose, and they collected weather and whatever the wind brought against the building's face. The north face of the building was not the face that received the most observation from the street. The hill's orientation and the building's position meant that the north face was somewhat removed from the primary pedestrian and vehicular traffic, looking out over a narrower field of the city's daily circulation. What rested on the ledges of the north face rested there without much likelihood of observation from below, from above, from inside the building, through the glass of the windows. The ledges were visible only at an angle, only to someone who had reason to look, only to someone who pressed close to the window and directed their gaze outward and slightly downward along the exterior face of the building. There is something particular about the geography of a large institutional building in a city, the way certain surfaces of it are simultaneously public and unattended, simultaneously visible and unseen. The north ledges of Harborview Medical Center in 1977 existed in exactly this condition. They were not hidden. Anyone on the street at the right angle and with enough height of view could in principle have seen what was on them. But no one was looking for any particular reason. No one had a reason to look unless they knew something was there, or unless they were told to look, or unless some account of what might be on the ledge had reached them through a channel that made looking worth the effort. The hospital staff went about their work inside. The administrative systems of the institution ran their daily cycle of records and rounds and handoffs. The social work department conducted its work in its particular institutional register. The conversations, the documentation, the coordination of discharge planning, and patient advocacy. The ward where a recently resuscitated woman lay in a bed was a ward like other wards, running at the pace of a ward in a public hospital, with the specific unhurried texture of institutional time that is not slow exactly, but is certainly not fast, a time that moves in its own register, calibrated to the needs of patients who are not going anywhere, and of staff who are managing a caseload rather than a single encounter. The winter of 1977 in Seattle was a winter like the winters that precede and follow it, in a maritime Pacific Northwest climate. Not dramatic, not marked by the kind of weather that generates civic memory, simply present, the gray light, the persistent low overcast, the wet air that settles over the city from October through April, with the patient authority of a climate that has been this way for longer than the city has existed, and will be this way long after it. The buildings on First Hill stood in that climate in the way they had always stood, their exteriors accumulating the quiet residue of years, their ledges collecting what arrived there on the wind and not being otherwise attended to. A hospital is a place where time runs in several registers simultaneously. There is the clinical time of vital signs and medication schedules and shift changes, running with precision and discipline, because precision and discipline are what the clinical work requires. There is the administrative time of the institution's bureaucratic cycle, running more slowly, accumulating paper and records and documentation that will persist long after the clinical events it records have passed. And there is the time of the patient's experience, the slow, strange, altered time of illness and recovery, in which the ordinary markers of the day lose their authority and something else organizes the hours. The recently resuscitated patient lies in her bed in this third kind of time, and the city runs in its ordinary time outside the window, and the gray Pacific light holds everything in its quiet, diffuse consistency. Harborview Medical Center in 1977 was the institution it was because the city had made it that way, publicly funded, publicly obligated, open to a population that private institutions were less structured to serve. The building on its hill above the city was not incidental to any of this. Its position, its architecture, its narrow concrete ledges on its north face, the gray light that fell on those ledges in the winter and the summer and the spring, all of this was the specific physical world in which a specific set of events had occurred or would occur, depending on where in the sequence one locates the beginning. The ledge was there before Maria arrived. The city was there before the hospital was built. The sound was there, the water, the hills, the gray Pacific light, pressing down over Elliott Bay from a sky that had not changed its character in any essential way since long before the city existed. The streets of Seattle below the hill moved through their ordinary November or December afternoon. The hospital's upper floors looked out over the rooftops. The exterior face of the building, its north side, its third floor, its narrow concrete ledge running along the facade, was in the light and the air, neither remarkable nor attended to, part of the building's geography in the specific quiet way that architectural protrusions on large institutional buildings are always part of their geography, present, functional in the minimal sense, and largely unobserved. The windows of the wards looked out over this face of the building. The light that came through them was the same light that fell on the ledge outside, the same flat, even gray Pacific Northwest light that made no particular claim on the attention, but was simply there, consistent and patient, the light of a city that had learned to live under its particular sky. A social worker moving through a ward might glance at one of these windows and see the exterior face of the building and the ledge below the glass, and in ordinary circumstances register nothing in particular and continue moving. There was nothing in the ordinary conduct of the ward's day that would make the exterior ledge of the north face of the building's third floor an object of sustained attention. What Harborview Medical Center was in 1977 was a working public hospital in a mid-sized Pacific Northwest city, standing on a steep hill above the downtown core, its windows looking out over the gray water of Elliott Bay and the rooftops below, and the narrow exterior ledges of its own facade, its social work department doing the patient work of listening and documenting and coordinating that public hospitals require, its wards running at the quiet institutional pace of a place that receives whoever needs receiving and works through the clinical and human consequences of whatever arrives. The building stood on its hill. Its ledges were in the light. The city moved below. The sound carried up from the streets, muted and distant, through the glass of the windows, into the wards where the work of the institution continued, patient and unhurried, in the gray Pacific light. A dark tennis shoe, left-footed, worn at the little toe on the outer edge, where the fabric had thinned from months of pressing against the same small point of friction. One lace not tied, not draped over the side of the shoe, but folded and tucked beneath the heel, as though pushed there by a hand, or settled there by some slow drift no one had observed. This is what Maria described to Kimberly Clark Sharp from a hospital bed at Harborview Medical Center in 1977, a shoe she said she had seen on a narrow concrete ledge on the north exterior face of the building, 3 floors above the street, at a point she should not have been able to reach with her eyes under any ordinary account of where she had been and what her body had been doing at the time. The details Maria offered were specific in a way that made them testable. She did not describe a shoe in general terms. She described this shoe, its color, its footedness, the precise location of its wear, the position of its lace. The worn patch was on the little toe side of the outer edge of a left shoe. She said the kind of mark that builds slowly over many months of wear and sits in a place easy to miss unless the angle of observation is exactly right. The lace was tucked under the heel, not knotted, not dangling, tucked. The spatial specificity of this detail, where the lace was, how it was positioned, implied a vantage point from which that particular arrangement would be visible, which is to say, a point close to the level of the ledge, looking across it rather than down onto it from a significant height. This is the part of the case that researchers return to most consistently. The worn patch over the little toe is a detail that accumulates through use rather than design. It is not a detail that appears on a shoe the way color or style appears. It is the record of a specific person wearing a specific shoe in a specific way for a long time, the material of the upper thinning and softening where one particular toe pressed against it, day after day. From a distance, from a window, from an angle that did not allow close inspection, this detail could be invisible. The question that the specificity of Maria's description raised, and that it still raises, formally, without a resolved answer, is from where, exactly, a person would need to be positioned to see it. Sharp documented that when she went to the north face of the building and pressed her face against a third-floor window, angling her view outward and downward, she could see the ledge, she could see the shoe, and what she found there, she reported, matched what Maria had described: the worn toe, the tucked lace, the left foot, the dark color, and the details that Maria had specified before Sharp had gone to look. This is the core of the evidentiary record, as it exists in Sharp's published account. A woman described an object. Another woman went to look. The object was there, and the description matched. The ledge itself is worth holding in mind as a physical fact. It was a standard architectural protrusion on the third-floor exterior of Harborview. the kind of narrow concrete shelf that appears on institutional buildings of that era as a structural or decorative element with no practical function. It was not a maintenance walkway. There was no door to it, no ladder reaching it from below, no fire escape running along it, no window that opened onto it in any way that would allow a person to step out. The ledge sat approximately 30 feet above street level on the north face of the building, too high to see clearly from the pavement below without craning the neck and squinting into the gray Pacific Northwest sky. Sharp's published description of the ledge's accessibility, or rather, its inaccessibility, is consistent with a location that accumulates objects through chance rather than human placement, a surface where a wind-blown thing might land and rest undisturbed for days or weeks or months without anyone noticing it was there. A shoe on a ledge like that would arrive by accident. There is no practical way it arrived any other way. It did not belong there in any functional sense. It was not placed there by someone who had walked along the ledge to set it down. It was not visible from the rooms facing north in any obvious way. Sharp had to press her face to the glass and angle her gaze to find it. It sat on a narrow strip of concrete on the outside of a large building, alone in the quiet exterior air of the third floor, dark against the pale concrete, its worn toe facing outward, its lace folded beneath it, as though it had simply drifted there and settled. The evidentiary question that the case rests on is whether the description Maria gave, before Sharp went to look, was specific enough and accurate enough to require an explanation beyond ordinary perception. This is not a simple question to answer, and researchers who have examined the case have come down in genuinely different places on it. The details Maria specified, the side of the shoe, the location of the worn area, the position of the lace, are concrete. They are the kind of details that distinguish one shoe from another. They are not the generic details a person would produce if describing a shoe from imagination or vague memory. A shoe is dark, a shoe is old. The specificity is of a different order. Which side, which toe, which lace, tucked how, and where. Susan Blackmore, writing in Dying to Live in 1993, examined this question with care. Her position was that the description, while specific, was not specific enough to rule out ordinary explanation. A worn shoe with a marked little toe area and a lace tucked under the heel is, she argued, a description that would fit a reasonably wide range of old worn shoes. If the match between Maria's description and the actual shoe was not exact in every detail, if, for instance, the degree of wear or the precise position of the lace was close but not precise, then the match becomes less remarkable and more consistent with what a reasonable guess or a partially remembered observation might produce. Blackmore's argument is not that Maria was lying or that Sharp was fabricating. It is that the description Maria gave, taken on its own terms, does not exclude ordinary explanations with the certainty that a genuinely veridical account would need to demonstrate. This is a fair point, and it sits inside a larger problem with the evidentiary chain. No photographs of the shoe on the ledge appear to have been taken before it was retrieved. No contemporaneous written record of Maria's description, made in the moment she gave it, before Sharp went to look, appears to have been preserved in a form that has been made available for independent examination. The documentation of the case rests primarily on Sharp's own recollection and her subsequent published account, which appeared in her 1994 memoir, After the Light, approximately 17 years after the events it describes. The shoe, if it was kept, has not surfaced in any publicly documented archive. The ledge can be examined, but the shoe is gone, and the exact wording of Maria's original description before the verification attempt is not preserved in any independently verifiable contemporaneous form. The evidentiary chain in a case of this kind requires that the description be recorded before the verification, that the verification be conducted by someone other than the person who recorded the description, and that the results be documented in a form preserved independently of the memory of any single witness. In Maria's case, none of these methodological conditions was met. Sharp recorded the description, Sharp conducted the verification, and the account of both was preserved primarily in Sharp's own memory over a period of 17 years before reaching print. Augustine's position is not that the case is false, it is that the case as documented cannot be used as reliable empirical evidence because the conditions necessary to establish reliability were not in place when the events occurred. This is the honest shape of what the case offers as evidence. It is a documented account of a specific description matched to a physical object. It is a case in which the description was specific, the object was real, and the match was reported by a witness who subsequently wrote about it at length and in good faith. It is also a case in which no photograph of the shoe in position was taken, no contemporaneous written record of the description survives in independently verifiable form, and the primary documentation was produced from memory nearly 2 decades after the events. The case sits inside that gap, specific enough to be interesting, underdocumented enough to be unresolvable. Skeptical investigators have offered additional hypotheses about how the match between Maria's description and the actual shoe might have come about through ordinary means. One proposal is that Maria saw the shoe through a window during a conscious period before her cardiac arrest, that she had been walked or wheeled past a north-facing room or had stood at a window herself, and that a brief glance had registered the shoe without her consciously noting it at the time. If this happened, the memory might have surfaced later, during the altered states of a cardiac event and its aftermath, in a way that felt to Maria like a distinct perception occurring during her out-of-body experience, rather than an ordinary prior observation. This hypothesis is plausible in general terms, but it also cannot be confirmed. There is no documentation of Maria's movements within the hospital before her arrest, no record of which rooms she passed through or which windows she may have seen from, and no way now to reconstruct what she might have observed in those early hours. A second hypothesis is that information about the shoe reached Maria through ordinary auditory or conversational channels, that someone on the hospital staff had noticed it or mentioned it, or that Maria had overheard a conversation in which it was referred to without consciously registering that she had heard anything. This kind of unconscious auditory absorption is a well-documented phenomenon, and it represents a genuine alternative explanation for cases in which a person reports knowledge of something they believe they could not have known through ordinary means. Again, this is plausible in principle and unverifiable in practice. No one has documented any such conversation. No staff member has come forward to say the shoe was a known object, and the hypothesis rests on a possibility rather than a demonstrated chain of events. The difficulty with both of these hypotheses is the same difficulty that runs through the skeptical position on the case more broadly. They are plausible, they are not ruled out, and they cannot be confirmed. The window glance hypothesis and the overheard conversation hypothesis are each genuinely possible. They are also, each of them, unsupported by any positive evidence. The case sits in a space where neither the paranormal account nor the ordinary explanation account can be established with the evidence that survives. What can be said with confidence is that Maria described the shoe was there, and the description matched in the details she had specified. What remains genuinely open is how she knew. The worn patch over the little toe is worth returning to as an image. It is a small thing, a thinning of dark fabric on the outer edge of an old shoe, the kind of mark that forms over months of use and sits quietly at the margin of what a person would notice unless they were close and looking carefully. If Maria described this detail accurately, and Sharp's account holds that she did, then the account implies an angle of observation that would make it visible from inside the building through glass, from a position at roughly the height of the third floor, looking outward across the ledge. The worn toe might be visible if the light was right and the shoe was positioned correctly. From below, from the street, from any position that did not involve being approximately level with the ledge, the detail would likely be lost. Maria said she had floated outside the building and seen the shoe from a position consistent with ledge height. She described the patch on the toe. Whether these two facts are connected is the question the case poses and does not answer. The tucked lace is a different kind of detail. It implies not just an angle of observation, but a knowledge of something the shoe was doing at its base, a lace that had slipped or been pushed beneath the heel, invisible from above if the shoe were seen from a position looking down, more visible from a position at roughly the same level as the shoe's base. A person seeing the shoe from directly above might see the toe, the tongue, the upper surface of the shoe, and might not see a lace tucked beneath the heel unless they were positioned to see it. A person floating at ledge height, looking across rather than down, might see it. This is the spatial logic that Sharp's account and subsequent discussions of the case return to. The idea that the specific details Maria reported are consistent with a specific vantage point, and that vantage point is not the vantage point of a person lying in a hospital bed. The counter-argument is that a person describing a shoe from imagination or from a partially remembered prior observation would not necessarily report only the details consistent with one precise angle. Memory does not always observe the constraints of perspective. A person recalling something they saw briefly might produce details that their angle of vision would not have revealed, drawing on general knowledge of what shoes look like rather than on what they specifically observed. A person who had glimpsed the shoe from a window might recall it with more detail than the glimpse actually provided. The tucked lace might be a detail produced by imagination rather than observation, applied to a mental image of the shoe and coincidentally matching the actual shoe's condition. Thus is possible. Whether it is what happened is not established. What Blackmore's analysis, Augustine's analysis, and the broader skeptical engagement with the case share is a careful attention to the conditions under which a description can be said to constitute evidence of something beyond ordinary explanation. The standard they apply is a high one, not because they are hostile to the account, but because the claim, if accurate, is significant, and significant claims require that the alternative explanations be genuinely excluded before the remarkable interpretation is accepted. In Maria's case, the alternative explanations have not been excluded. They have also not been confirmed. The case occupies the space between those two positions, and it has remained there for decades without moving decisively in either direction. There is a particular quality to the physical details at the center of the case: the worn toe, the tucked lace, the left foot, the dark color, the narrow ledge, the north face, the third floor, that makes the case persistent in a way that purely theoretical discussions of near-death experience do not tend to be. These are concrete, specific things. They have weight and texture. The shoe was real. The ledge was real. The worn patch was a real feature of a real object. The case is interesting precisely because it is not abstract. It is grounded in a specific object at a specific location, and the question it poses is specific. How did Maria know what was there? The ledge itself continues to exist. Harborview Medical Center still stands on First Hill in Seattle, its exterior architecture largely unchanged in its basic structure. The north face of the building still has the kind of narrow concrete protrusions that appear on institutional buildings of its era. The third floor is still there. Whether the ledge where the shoe was found is still exactly as it was, whether it still bears the marks of years of accumulated weather and wind-blown objects, is not something that has been documented in any published account. The building is there. The ledge is there, or was there, in all the ways that matter to the physical geography of the case. What is not there is the shoe. It was retrieved. Sharp's account indicates this, but its whereabouts afterward, whether it was kept as evidence, whether it was documented in any formal way, whether it still exists somewhere in a collection or an archive or the storage of the hospital, is not recorded in any published source that has been made available to researchers. The shoe that sat on the ledge through weather and days, and the slow, quiet accumulation of an exterior life on the north face of a large building in the Pacific Northwest, is simply gone from the evidentiary record. What remains is the description, the reported match, the published account, and the open question. The specificity of the case is also its limitation, because the case rests on particular physical details. This toe, this lace, this ledge, this shoe, the absence of preserved documentation of those details, is a genuine evidentiary problem that cannot be resolved by the accumulation of more theoretical argument. Argument about what Maria could or could not have seen through ordinary means cannot fill the gap left by the absence of a photograph, a contemporaneous written record, or an independently verified chain of custody for the shoe itself. The case offers what it offers, which is the published account of a specific claimed match between a specific description and a specific physical object. It does not offer more than that. The researchers and critics who have engaged with it most carefully are in agreement on this point, even when they disagree on how the match should be interpreted. The question of the worn patch's visibility from particular angles, raised by Sharp, examined by Blackmore, noted by Augustine and Holden in their analyses, is one that seems as though it ought to be resolvable through careful physical reconstruction of the geometry. If the shoe's toe was worn in a specific way, and the shoe sat on the ledge in a specific orientation, then the angles from which that worn patch would be visible could in principle be worked out. If the angle required is inconsistent with any window in the hospital from which a conscious patient might have glimpsed it, that would strengthen the case for something unusual. If the angle required is consistent with a window that Maria might have passed, that would weaken it. This kind of physical reconstruction has not been published in any form that has become part of the mainstream discussion of the case. The geometry of the thing, the specific visual geometry of the worn patch, and the tucked lace, and the angle from which they would be visible, remains, like so much else in the case, unmeasured. A researcher encountering the case for the first time in Sharp's written account would find the details arriving in a specific order. First the description, then the verification, then the match, and would feel, reading it, the specific quality of a detail that seems harder to explain than it should be. The worn patch over the little toe, the lace under the heel, these are not details that feel like they were invented, and they do not feel like details that were produced by looking at a shoe from a great distance. They feel like details that came from close observation, whether that observation was the one Maria described, floating at ledge height outside a hospital building during cardiac arrest, or something more ordinary, is the question the case raises and leaves standing. The shoe sat on the ledge before Sharp went to look. It had been there for some unknown period, days, weeks, the duration was never established, sitting on the narrow concrete shelf on the north exterior face of the building, its worn toe facing outward, its lace folded beneath it, the gray Pacific Northwest sky above, and the street 30 feet below. The city moved below the ledge. Traffic passed on the hill. The hospital continued its interior life. The wards, the resuscitation rooms, the corridor sounds, the institutional light. On the outside of one north-facing wall, on a narrow strip of concrete at the height of the third floor, a single dark shoe sat undisturbed in the exterior air, facing outward, worn at the little toe, its tucked lace hidden from view, except from exactly the right angle, resting in the open quiet of a surface no one could easily reach, and no one had any particular reason to look at. A woman who had been unconscious inside the building said she had seen it from outside. She said she had been floating near it. She described the worn patch. She described the lace. And when another woman pressed her face to the glass of a third-floor window and angled her gaze carefully outward and slightly down, the shoe was there, dark, worn at the toe, lace tucked under the heel, exactly where Maria had said it would be, exactly as she had described it, resting on a ledge in the quiet exterior air of the building, in a city that moved below it, unaware. The question of how Maria knew the shoe was there, its color, its footedness, its worn little toe patch, its tucked lace, its position on a narrow ledge on the north face of the third floor of a large public hospital in Seattle in 1977 has not been answered with any certainty in the decades since it was first posed. The alternative explanations are real possibilities. The documentation gaps are genuine limitations. The specificity of the description is a real feature of the account. All of these things are true at once, and the case holds them all together without resolving them, resting quietly inside a space where the evidence is specific enough to matter and underdocumented enough to remain open. A single dark shoe on a concrete ledge, seen by a woman who should not have been able to see it, its worn toe and tucked lace still sitting in the record, patient and particular and unexplained. In a bookstore in 1975, on a shelf somewhere between popular psychology and the self-help titles, a slim paperback appeared with a quiet cover and a title that did not announce itself loudly. The book was called Life After Life. Its author was Raymond Moody, a philosopher and physician who had spent years collecting accounts from people who had been resuscitated after their hearts stopped. And what he had gathered in those pages was something that did not yet have a name. By the time the book had been in circulation for a year, it had given the phenomena 1. Moody had interviewed approximately 150 people across the preceding years, patients who had been revived after cardiac arrest, survivors of accidents and surgeries, individuals who had returned from the threshold of what medicine classified as death. What they described in account after account had a consistent shape, a detachment from the body, a movement through darkness, a presence or a light, a return that was difficult to articulate. Moody collected these accounts and published them in a form accessible enough for ordinary readers, specific enough to be taken seriously by researchers, and strange enough to arrest attention in a way that no academic journal article had managed to do. The book sold millions of copies. It was translated, it was reviewed, it was argued over in hospital corridors and faculty meetings and living rooms across the country, and the argument it generated did not settle. The term Moody gave the phenomenon was near-death experience. It was not a term that asserted anything about what the experience was or where it came from. It described only what it described, something that occurred in proximity to death. That neutrality was deliberate, and it mattered, because what the term allowed was a framework precise enough to be useful without committing anyone to a conclusion about what the framework contained. In the years after Life appeared, that framework would be picked up by researchers with different methodologies, different institutional affiliations, and different degrees of skepticism, and the questions Moody had posed in popular form would move into academic language, into conference proceedings, into peer-reviewed journals, and eventually into hospital protocols designed to test what the accounts were actually reporting. 2 years after Life appeared in bookstores, Maria arrived at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. The cultural world that had been prepared to receive her account was very different from the world that had existed a decade earlier. Before Moody's book, a patient who woke from resuscitation and described floating above her body, drifting through walls, observing things she should not have been able to see, that patient would have been received, in most clinical settings, with polite concern and a quiet notation in the chart. The account would have been understood as a symptom, a confusion, a product of the brain under oxygen deprivation, and it would have been moved past. After Moody's book, the account was still moved past in most clinical settings, but it was no longer a symptom without a name. The name existed, the conversation existed, and in a small number of hospitals and research institutions, the people who listened had begun to wonder whether something more careful could be done with the accounts they were hearing. Kimberly Clark Sharp was a social worker at Harborview in the late 1970s, and working with the patient population that a large urban public hospital receives, people in crisis, people without resources, people navigating medical emergencies without the social infrastructure that private care can provide. Her work put her in sustained contact with patients in recovery, and it was in that context that she encountered Maria. What Maria described to her was specific enough and precise enough in its physical details that Sharp did not set it aside. She wrote it down. She remembered it. She went to the window and looked for the shoe. The account Sharp carried forward from that encounter in 1977 did not reach the broader research community in written form for approximately 17 years. She presented the case at conferences of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in the late 1980s and early 1990s, describing from memory the events of that day, the woman in the bed, the description of the ledge, the shoe with the worn toe, and the tucked lace, the confirmation she had found by pressing her face against the glass. The case found a receptive audience in those conference rooms because by the late 1980s, the research community that had grown up around near-death experience accounts was well established, and the question that Maria's account raised, whether someone in cardiac arrest could perceive physical details inaccessible through ordinary sensory channels, was exactly the question that community was organized around. The International Association for Near-Death Studies had been founded in 1981, drawing together researchers from medicine, psychology, philosophy, and religious studies who shared an interest in the consistent features of near-death accounts without necessarily sharing a common interpretation of what those features meant. The organization provided a venue and a publication, the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and it created the institutional conditions under which a case like Maria's could be documented, circulated, and subjected to scrutiny across disciplines. Sharp's presentations at the association's conferences in the late 1980s were the first time the case had been formally aired in a research context, and the reception they received reflected the dual status the case would hold for decades afterward. Compelling as an example, limited as evidence, impossible to settle. The 17-year gap between the original events and their first formal presentation is a detail that skeptical researchers have returned to repeatedly, and with reason. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction shaped by everything that has happened between the original event and the moment of recall, and 17 years contains a great deal of shaping. The specific details Sharp described, the worn patch, the tucked lace, the position of the shoe on the ledge, had existed in her memory across nearly 2 decades before they appeared in a conference room or on a printed page. What that means for the account's reliability is not a matter of any researcher's character or honesty. It is a matter of how memory works, and researchers who have examined the case carefully have noted that the gap is simply too large to bridge with the tools available. Sharp's formal written account of the case was published in 1994 in her memoir After the Light. The book was her sustained account of her years working with near-death experience reports at Harborview and afterward, and it placed Maria's case in the context of Sharp's broader investigation into what patients described during and after resuscitation. The publication of After the Light gave the case a fixed written form for the first time. The specific language in which the shoe's details were described, the specific account of how Sharp had gone to the window and found the shoe, the specific framing of what the case had come to mean to her. Researchers citing the case from that point forward were working from that written account, and the distance between the 1994 text and the 1977 events remained part of every citation's context. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, had been developing the academic framework for NDE research since the late 1970s, and his work represents a distinct methodological step from what Moody had produced, where Moody had assembled accounts and presented them in narrative form. Ring had built a structured interview protocol and a weighted scoring system, the Weighted Core Experience Index, designed to allow comparative analysis across large numbers of accounts. His 1980 study, Life at Death, was based on interviews with 102 near-death survivors conducted throughout the late 1970s, and it brought quantitative structure to a field that had operated almost entirely in anecdote and narrative. Ring was working from the premise that if near-death accounts reflected a genuine phenomenon, rather than random neurological noise, that phenomenon should have a consistent internal structure across accounts from different people, different settings, and different cultures. The Weighted Core Experience Index was his instrument for testing that hypothesis, assigning numerical weights to specific features of reported experiences, and producing a composite score that could be compared across subjects. The existence of such an instrument did not settle what near-death accounts were, but it created the conditions under which the question could be investigated systematically rather than impressionistically, and that shift mattered for how subsequent cases, including Maria's, were evaluated. Ring's framework did not have a direct mechanism for handling the specific kind of claim Maria's case represented, a veridical claim, meaning a claim that something perceived during the experience matched physical reality in a way that could be checked. The Weighted Core Experience Index measured the phenomenology of the experience itself, the feeling of separation from the body, the movement through darkness, the encounter with a presence or a light. It did not have a category for shoe on ledge. But Ring's broader project had established the principle that near-death accounts were worth investigating rigorously, and that principle was the one that made investigators take Maria's account seriously enough to examine the physical evidence it implied. Janice Miner Holden, a professor at the University of North Texas and a researcher who had spent years working in the field of near-death studies, undertook a systematic review of what she called veridical cases, accounts in which near-death experiencers claimed to have perceived specific, checkable physical information during their experience that was later confirmed by investigation. Maria's case was included in that review. Holden's analysis noted both its status as a frequently cited example and its evidentiary limitations, the absence of contemporaneous documentation, the absence of corroborating witnesses to the original account, the absence of preserved physical evidence from the shoe itself, and the 17-year gap before formal publication. Her review was not a dismissal of the case. It was a careful accounting of what the case established and what it did not, and it placed those limitations on the record in terms that subsequent researchers could engage with, rather than simply repeat the case's famous details. The question Holden's review was ultimately asking was whether taken near-death accounts could function as empirical data, whether a story told by a resuscitated patient about something she perceived outside her body could, under the right conditions and with the right documentation, constitute genuine evidence of something that required explanation. The answer her review produced was careful and conditional. Yes, in principle, if the documentation were contemporaneous, if corroborating witnesses existed, if the physical evidence were preserved and accessible, if the circumstances of potential ordinary sense perception were ruled out with sufficient rigor. For Maria's case, those conditions were not met. For future cases, they could be. That conditional answer, yes, in principle, if, is what moved NDE research from the retrospective to the prospective, from the collection of old accounts to the design of new experiments. The logic was direct. If the claim were that near-death experiencers sometimes perceive specific physical information from locations outside their bodies, then the way to test that claim was to place specific physical information in locations outside the body, above the body, specifically in positions visible only to someone floating near the ceiling of a resuscitation room, and wait to see whether resuscitated patients reported what was there. The design was simple. The execution required access to hospital resuscitation areas, cooperation from clinical staff, and patients measured in years. But the design was sound, and the question it was designed to answer was directly descended from the question Maria's shoe had first posed. Sam Parnia, a cardiac surgeon and researcher who had trained in the United Kingdom before establishing research programs in the United States, had been thinking about near-death experience accounts from within medicine for years before he launched the study that would come to be known as AWARE, an acronym for Awareness During Resuscitation. The study was prospective and systematic. Visual targets were hidden above resuscitation beds in participating hospital rooms, placed on high shelves or brackets at a height and angle that made them invisible from floor level, but potentially visible from above, facing upward if a patient being resuscitated in that room had any experience of perceiving their environment from a position above their body, and if they were able to report the content of that perception after resuscitation, the target was there to be either identified or missed. The targets were laminated cards. Their images were unknown to the clinical staff working in the rooms. They were placed before the patient arrived, and they remained in place across whatever period of resuscitation occurred. The patients who were resuscitated in those rooms had no ordinary means of knowing what was on them. If any patient reported seeing an image that matched what was on the target, that report would constitute the kind of contemporaneous, documented, physically anchored evidence that Maria's case had never had. The design was a direct experimental translation of the veridical NDE question into a form that could produce evidence of the kind skeptical researchers had noted was missing. Parnia's AWARE study began enrolling patients in the late 2000s, initially at hospitals in the United Kingdom and the United States. The The study's design had been shaped in part by the experience of the previous 2 decades of NDE research, including the methodological discussions that cases like Maria's had generated. The specific problem Maria's case illustrated, a compelling account with no contemporaneous documentation, no physical evidence preserved, no way to rule out ordinary explanations, was precisely the problem the AWARE study's design was intended to solve. The visual targets were there because the shoe had not been photographed. The prospective design was there because the 17-year gap had not been preventable once the gap had opened. The AWARE study's results were published in preliminary form in the academic literature in 2014 with Sam Parnia as lead author, and the findings were carefully reported. Among a large number of resuscitated patients enrolled in the study, a very small number reported near-death experiences, with any content specific enough to evaluate against the visual targets. Of those, a single case produced a report that was examined against the target, in the room where the patient had been resuscitated. The account was being analyzed and described in the literature in terms that maintained appropriate caution about what it did and did not establish. The study's successor investigations continued, with refined protocols, more participating hospitals, and a larger patient pool, the design being improved in the light of what the initial phase had produced, as any serious empirical program proceeds. The distance between Maria's account in 1977 and Sam Parnia's visual targets in hospital rooms in the late 2000s is a span of 3 decades. Across that span, the question Maria's account first made concrete, specifically spatially, physically concrete, had moved from a single social worker's memory to an organized research field to a systematic clinical protocol designed to test the claim under conditions that could produce reliable evidence. The people who built that progression were not all credulous. Many of them were skeptical. Many of them had constructed the most rigorous challenges to the accounts they were examining, and the rigor of those challenges was part of what had driven the design of prospective investigation. The debate over Maria's shoe was not simply a conversation between believers and skeptics. It was a methodological argument that produced better methodology, and the visual targets in AWARE's participating hospital rooms were in part its product. What the visual targets were waiting for in those hospital rooms in the late 2000s was the specific question that a woman in a Seattle hospital bed had asked in a different form 30 years earlier. The woman had described a shoe. A social worker had gone to a window and found one. No one had photographed it. No one had documented the encounter in the hospital chart. The shoe had disappeared from the building and from the record. And the question of how Maria had known it was there had never been answered and had moved forward through time in the company of researchers who found in that unanswered question a reason to design something that could, if the question were real, produce an answer. Kimberly Clark Sharp stood at a conference podium in the late 1980s and described from memory what had happened in 1977. The room she was speaking to contained researchers who had read Moody, who had read Ring, who had been collecting and debating near-death accounts for years, and what they heard in Sharp's account was the specific thing the field had been waiting for, a physical checkable claim that had been physically apparently confirmed. The worn toe, the tucked lace, the narrow ledge on the north side of the 3rd floor. These details had been in Sharp's memory for more than a decade before they entered the record, and the researchers in that room understood, as Sharp herself understood, that the gap was a problem. But the case was still the case. The shoe was still the shoe. The question it raised was still the same question, and the conference room it entered in the late 1980s was the institutional setting in which that question would be taken forward. The Journal of Near-Death Studies carries Maria's case in its citation record across multiple decades. It appears in review articles and theoretical papers and methodological discussions. It appears in articles arguing for the evidential significance of veridical accounts, and in articles arguing against that significance. It appears in both directions because it is genuinely useful in both directions, as an example of what a compelling veridical account looks like, and as an example of why compelling accounts require documentation that retrospective reports cannot provide. The case occupies both positions simultaneously, and that dual occupation is not a paradox. It is simply the condition of a case that sits precisely on the line between what is established and what is not. Raymond Moody, in the years after Life, continued working on near-death experience accounts without producing a definitive answer to the question he had named. He moved through academic appointments, continued publishing, and remained present in the field he had established. Kenneth Ring developed the research methodology further, founding the International Association for Near-Death Studies and continuing to produce quantitative studies across the 1980s and 1990s. Kimberly Clark Sharp continued her work in social work and NDE research and remained associated with the field through Sharp's own institutional and publication work. Sam Parnia continued designing and running prospective clinical investigations. The field that Moody had named in 1975 accumulated researchers, journals, conferences, and a substantial literature, and Maria's case remained in that literature, cited and recited, a small specific fact that the literature had not resolved and had not put down. The image of Kenneth Ring in the late 1970s, conducting a structured interview with a resuscitation survivor, the clipboard, the scoring system, the methodical attempt to apply quantitative structure to accounts of experience at the threshold of death, is worth holding for a moment, because it represents something particular about the progression from Moody to the Aware study. Moody had named the phenomenon in narrative. Ring had tried to measure it. Parnia had tried to test it against physical evidence under controlled conditions. Each step had been a response to the limitations of the step before, and each step had been driven in part by the need to answer the challenge posed by the previous generation's most compelling, unresolved case. The shoe had been one of those cases. It had not resolved. It had driven. What the Aware study added to the question Maria's case had posed was not an answer. The initial results were too limited in scope to constitute an answer to a question as large as whether consciousness can operate outside the body. What the study added was a method, a way of asking the question that could, in principle, produce the kind of evidence that would need to be taken seriously. The visual targets mounted above resuscitation beds in participating hospitals were there because the field had learned from 3 decades of retrospective cases that retrospective cases would never be enough. They were there because a social worker had pressed her face against a third-floor window in Seattle in 1977 and confirmed a detail no one had photographed, and the gap that confirmation left had shaped the next 30 years of methodological thinking. The work continued after the Aware study's initial publication. Parnia's team refined the protocol. More hospitals joined. The patient pool expanded. The results were being analyzed as the field moved forward, and the forward movement was itself part of what the field had been built to do, not to confirm or deny any particular metaphysical claim, but to follow the question to the point where evidence could speak, rather than merely argue. That point had not been reached by the time the initial results were published, and the field acknowledged that openly. The acknowledgement was not a concession of failure. It was the ordinary condition of rigorous inquiry into a question that is genuinely difficult. Maria's account, as Sharp had first recorded it, described a specific physical detail observed from a specific vantage point during a specific period of unconsciousness, and the account was later apparently confirmed by a specific physical object in a specific location. That chain of specificity was what made the case significant and what made it limited. It was significant because the details were precise. It was limited because the precision existed only in memory and in a social worker's account of what she had found, with no contemporaneous record and no preserved evidence. The chain was strong enough to make the question real and not strong enough to make the answer clear, and that tension between strength and limitation had sent 3 decades of researchers in search of a method that could resolve it. The resolve did not come. The search continued. Somewhere in a hospital room in a city participating in a prospective study, above a resuscitation bed, a laminated visual target sat face up on a high shelf in the particular quiet of a room where emergencies happened, and the question of what consciousness did during them was still, formally, open. The target was waiting for a patient who might, during the arrest and the resuscitation, rise above it and look down, and who might afterward remember what was on it. The patient had not yet arrived. The target was there because the question had arrived first, in 1977, in the form of a single worn shoe on a narrow concrete ledge on the north side of a building on First Hill in Seattle, and the question had not stopped arriving since. What Moody had named in 1975. Ring had structured in 1980, Sharp had documented in 1994, and Parnia had designed to test in the late 2000s was still, across all of that, the same question. It had the same shape it had always had. It was the shape of something that a person in cardiac arrest had described, not vaguely, not in the broad strokes that could be attributed to cultural conditioning or wishful reconstruction, but specifically, physically, with the kind of detail that could be checked. And across the decades in which the checking had been attempted, in retrospective review and prospective protocol and systematic clinical investigation, the question had remained the same question, still open, still generating new attempts at an answer, still sitting in the literature the way the shoe had sat on the ledge, present, specific, and not yet fully explained. The visual targets above the resuscitation beds were waiting. The journals continued to publish. The cases continued to arrive, retrospective, unverifiable, full of specific details that researchers could not rule in or out with the tools available. The field that Moody had established in a 1975 paperback had grown into an institution with its own methodologies, its own debates, and its own accumulated record of what had been tried and what had remained unresolved. And inside that institution, in the footnotes of review articles, and the citation lists of theoretical papers, and the case files of researchers who had spent their careers on the question, Maria's account was still there. The worn toe, the tucked lace, the woman who had described a shoe on a ledge she should not have been able to see, and the social worker who had gone to look and found it there. Maria left Seattle sometime in the months after her hospitalization in 1977. The precise date is not recorded. The circumstances of her departure are not documented in any published account. What is established is simply that she went, that the woman at the center of the case continued moving through her life, as people do, and that the contact between her and Kimberly Clark Sharp did not persist in any way that made follow-up possible. The case carried on without her. The shoe, the ledge, the narrow concrete protrusion on the north face of the Harborview building, all of it continued to exist in the record long after Maria herself had moved beyond anyone's ability to reach her. There is something quietly particular about a case that outlives its primary witness in this way. Not tragic. Exactly. Maria had described what she described. The account had been taken down, and then she had returned to the ordinary movement of her life. Seasonal work, new addresses, the next city, the next season, the way migrant workers do, the way people who are not famous and have not chosen to become the subject of any investigation generally do. The record did not follow her. The record stayed where it had been made, in Sharp's memory, and eventually in print, and Maria went on ahead of it, somewhere into the Pacific Northwest years, unreachable and untroubled by what her account had set in motion. The account itself, in the absence of its source, has been carried forward by the published literature that surrounds it. Sharp's 1994 memoir, After the Light, was the first sustained written documentation of the case, which means approximately 17 years passed between the events in the hospital and their formal appearance in print. Researchers who have examined the case since then have noted this gap as one of its central evidentiary limitations. Memory changes across 17 years. Details consolidate, clarify in ways that memory finds satisfying, lose the rough edges that contemporaneous documentation would have preserved. None of this means the account is fabricated. It means the account is subject to exactly the pressures that all retrospective testimony is subject to, and that no amount of subsequent investigation can fully correct for those pressures after the fact. The case is what it is, a documented account, carefully recorded from memory, specific in its details, and impossible now to verify against the moment in which it occurred. Sharp's memoir placed the shoe account in print and gave it a stable form that researchers could cite. Before the book, the case had circulated primarily through Sharp's presentations at conferences of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Spoken accounts, offered from memory, received by rooms of researchers who were themselves already predisposed to take the report seriously because they were gathered in precisely the context of taking such reports seriously. That is not a criticism of those early presentations. It is simply a description of the environment in which the case first moved through the academic world, an environment whose reception was warm, whose documentation was limited, and whose standards for evidentiary scrutiny were still being established. The International Association for Near-Death Studies had itself been founded only in 1978, 1 year after Maria's hospitalization. The field was new. The methods were being invented in real time by people who were still arguing about what counted as evidence, what counted as a veridical account, and what standard of documentation would be required before a case could be presented as meaningful rather than merely interesting. Maria's shoe entered that conversation at a formative moment before the standards had been fully articulated, and it has carried that early ambiguity with it ever since, appearing in the literature simultaneously as one of the most compelling cases on record and as one of the most instructive examples of what better documentation would have required. Janice Minor Holden, a researcher and professor at the University of North Texas, conducted a systematic review of veridical near-death experience cases that had been published in academic literature, and Maria's case appeared in that review, noted for its significance as a frequently cited example, and noted also for its evidentiary limitations. Holden's analysis observed that the case lacked the contemporaneous documentation that would have made its claims fully evaluable. No record made at the time of Maria's account, no preserved physical evidence, no independent corroboration from other witnesses present during the verification. What remained was a well-preserved retrospective account of an experience and a well-preserved retrospective account of the verification, both narrated by the same person, both committed to paper nearly 2 decades after the fact. The case is in many respects exactly what the field would later design prospective studies to move beyond, and exactly what those prospective studies used as their central example of what they were trying to improve upon. The Harborview Medical Center building still stands on First Hill in Seattle. Its exterior architecture is unchanged in the features that matter to this case. The third-floor facade still has the same basic proportions it had in 1977. The ledges that run along the exterior walls still project at roughly the same narrow width, and the north face of the building still looks out over the same urban terrain, the same grid of streets below, the same gray Pacific light pressing down from the west on clear afternoons. The specific ledge on which the shoe was found has not been documented photographically in any publicly available archive, which means there is no image to return to, no fixed visual record of the place in the state it was in, when Sharp pressed her face to the third-floor glass and looked outward and slightly downward and found what Maria had described. There is Sharp's description of that moment. There is the account of what she saw. And there is the building, still standing, the ledge still there, the question of what was on it in 1977, now sealed into the past, in the way that all unrecorded moments eventually are. The case has appeared in documentary productions across several decades. BBC and Discovery Channel programs on near-death experience have returned to it repeatedly, each time presenting it in essentially the same form. The worn toe, and the tucked lace, and the narrow ledge, and the unconscious woman and the social worker pressing her face to the glass. The documentary treatments have tended to present the case either as the strongest available example of veridical out-of-body perception, or as the most instructive example of the genre's evidentiary limitations, depending on the editorial disposition of the production. What is notable is that both framings use the same case, the same details, the same shoe. The facts of the account do not change between the version that finds them compelling and the version that finds them cautionary. What changes is the weight assigned to the absence of contemporaneous documentation and the degree of skepticism brought to Sharp's retrospective account of the verification. The shoe sits at the center of both interpretations, unchanged, a dark tennis shoe on a narrow concrete ledge, its little toe patch worn through, its lace tucked under the heel in some moment no one witnessed. Academic literature has continued to cite the case across the decades since Sharp's memoir was published. The Journal of Near-Death Studies has carried references to it in the context of reviews focused on anomalous cognition, consciousness research, and the philosophy of mind. The case appears not as settled evidence of anything, but as a recurring illustration of the methodological question the field has not yet been able to resolve, whether spontaneous retrospective accounts, however specific and however carefully documented after the fact, can serve as the basis for empirical claims about the nature of consciousness and perception. The shoe is in this sense still working. It is still generating the question it generated in Sharp's published account, still appearing in the footnotes of papers whose authors were not present in Seattle in 1977 and have no access to evidence beyond what Sharp recorded and what subsequent researchers have assessed. It has become a reference point, a benchmark, the specific case that researchers in this field point to when they want to describe both what veridical NDE accounts could establish and what would be required to establish it properly. What the shoe established, in the most careful possible reading of the available record, is this: a woman described a specific shoe in a specific location with specific details that were subsequently found to correspond to a shoe that was actually there. The degree to which this correspondence is significant depends on factors that cannot now be resolved. How general or specific the description was in its initial form before any verification occurred. How accessible the shoe could have been to ordinary perception during Maria's time in or around the hospital before her cardiac arrest, and whether any information about the shoe could have reached her through ordinary auditory or conversational channels without her consciously registering it. And none of these alternative explanations can be confirmed. None of them can be ruled out. The case sits at the intersection of all of them, specific enough to be interesting, ambiguous enough to resist closure, and old enough that the conditions for a definitive answer are no longer available. Sam Parnia's AWARE study placed hidden visual targets above resuscitation beds in hospital rooms, laminated cards mounted on high shelves, face up, invisible from floor level, designed to be seen only from a vantage point above the bed. The study was designed to test precisely what Maria's account had suggested was possible, that a person during cardiac arrest might perceive verifiable details from a position outside their own body, details that could not have been accessed through ordinary sensory means. The study ran across multiple hospital sites. Its design was careful, its documentation contemporaneous, its methods transparent. Where Maria's case was retrospective, singular, and dependent on a single narrator's memory across 17 years. The AWARE study was prospective, reproducible, and designed to produce the kind of contemporaneous record that Maria's case had lacked. It was, in a real and traceable sense, the institutional response to the question the shoe had posed. The methods that Maria's case made necessary, by demonstrating so precisely what undocumented spontaneous accounts could and could not establish, were the methods that the AWARE study was built to provide. The results of the AWARE study and its successor investigations have been complex and are still being analyzed and published. The hidden targets were seen, in most documented cases, by no one. A small number of reports described visual details from elevated vantage points during resuscitation. The analysis of those reports is ongoing, and no definitive conclusion has been entered. The study has not resolved the question. What it has done is establish the question on firmer methodological ground, moved it from the domain of retrospective anecdote into the domain of prospective investigation, from the ward of memory into the ward of contemporaneous record. Maria's shoe made that move possible, or at least helped make it visible, by being specific enough to hold the question open and ambiguous enough to demand a better answer. The copy of After the Light that Sharp published in 1994 is still in circulation, in library collections, in personal archives, on the shelves of researchers who work in consciousness studies and anomalous cognition, in the reading histories of people who encountered it in the 1990s and have been thinking about the worn toe and the tucked lace ever since. The book is a memoir, not a research paper, and it carries the particular authority and the particular limitations of that form. Personal, committed, careful in its details, but without the apparatus of peer review and independent verification that the academic literature requires. Within those limits, it is the primary source. And everything the literature knows about Maria's shoe comes through Sharp's account, which means everything the literature knows about this case is filtered through a single narrator, a single memory, a single commitment to the significance of what occurred. That is not unusual for cases of this kind. It is simply the condition of the record as it exists, and as it will continue to exist. Maria herself has not been located or interviewed by any researcher whose work has been published in the accessible literature. The case's primary witness is gone from the record, in the most ordinary possible way. She moved on. She was never famous. She was a migrant worker with no permanent address and no particular reason to maintain contact with a hospital social worker in a city she had passed through during a medical emergency. The case did not give her any particular stake in being found. She had described what she had described. She had presumably gone back to her life. Whatever she thought about the shoe, about what her account meant, about the 17 years between the hospital room and the published memoir, about the researchers and the documentaries and the journal citations that accumulated around something she had said in a conversation with a social worker in 1977. None of that has been recorded anywhere that the accessible literature reaches. The case continues without her. It carries her name, her experience, her specific and careful description of a worn left tennis shoe on a narrow concrete ledge, and she is, in the most practical sense, absent from it. There is a way of thinking about this, the absence of Maria from the case that bears her name, that is not melancholy, but simply accurate. Cases survive their principles all the time. Witnesses die. People move. The undocumented majority of any investigation's human participants eventually disappear from the accessible record, and the case continues in whatever form the documentation has captured. What Maria left in the record is specific and durable. The worn patch over the little toe on the outer edge of a left-footed shoe, the lace folded under the heel rather than tied, the narrow ledge on the north face of a large hospital building above downtown Seattle, the social worker pressing her face to the glass of the third-floor window, looking for something she had been told was there by a woman who had been unconscious. That is what the record contains. It is a very precise set of details to have come from the circumstances in which they were reported, and their precision is exactly what the case has always rested on, not on Maria's ongoing presence in the conversation, not on her ability to be interviewed or cross-examined or asked again in different words, but on the specificity of what she said once in a hospital room shortly after being resuscitated, to a woman who was listening carefully enough to remember it for 17 years and then write it down. The question of how she knew is still formally open. Researchers have proposed the hypotheses that the available evidence can sustain, that she might have seen the shoe during a conscious moment before her arrest, that information about it might have reached her through ordinary channels she had not registered consciously, that the description she offered was general enough to describe a wide range of shoes, and the correspondence with the actual shoe was less remarkable than it appeared. None of these hypotheses has been confirmed. None has been ruled out. The evidentiary record does not support a definitive answer in any direction, and the passage of nearly 5 decades since 1977 has not improved the record's capacity to yield one. The question sits where it has always sat, at the edge of what the documentation can establish, in the quiet space between what Maria described and what the documentation can confirm about how she could have known it. The ledge on the north face of the Harborview building in Seattle runs along the third-floor exterior at a height that would have been unreachable from the street without specialized equipment, and invisible from the ground without craning the neck at a significant angle. Nothing about it invites attention. It is an architectural protrusion of the kind that institutional buildings acquire in their construction, a decorative or structural detail that serves no particular purpose once the building is complete, that accumulates weather and the occasional wind-blown object, and is otherwise unobserved and unremarked upon by the people moving through the building below it. A shoe on such a ledge could rest there for a considerable time, weeks, months, without attracting notice from anyone whose ordinary movements kept them within the building or on the street below. The shoe was there. Sharp found it. Maria had described it. The ledge held it in the gray Pacific light, above the traffic and the institutional noise of a public hospital on a steep hill above downtown Seattle, in the quiet exterior air of a building going about its ordinary functions. Consciousness research has not resolved the questions that Maria's account placed inside the academic literature. The field has expanded considerably since 1977. The researchers are more numerous, the methods are more refined, the institutional settings are more formally equipped to gather contemporaneous data during resuscitation events. The AWARE study represents a level of methodological rigor that would have been impossible in a public hospital in 1977, when the concept of a prospective veridical NDE investigation had not yet been formulated, and the International Association for Near-Death Studies did not yet exist. And yet the fundamental question, whether human consciousness can perceive verifiable information from a position outside the physical body, remains where it was when Maria described a shoe on a ledge to a social worker who wrote it down in her memory and held it there for nearly 2 decades. The question is still open. The research continues. The answer, if there is one, has not yet appeared in any form the published literature has been able to confirm. There is something quietly companionable about a question that has been this patient, that has sat in the literature for this long, in essentially the same form, with essentially the same evidence, generating the same careful analyses and the same careful counter-arguments, without tipping into resolution in either direction. The shoe is not going to yield a definitive answer. The ledge is not going to offer documentation it did not have in 1977. Maria is not going to be located and interviewed. Sharp's account is not going to be supplemented by contemporaneous records that were never made. The case is complete in its incompleteness. It has, in the language of the research field, been thoroughly analyzed, and its limitations have been precisely described, and that thoroughness and that precision have not resolved it. They have simply made the open question cleaner. They have stripped away the ambiguities that could be reduced and left only the ambiguities that cannot. What remains is the match between a specific description and a specific shoe, the narrow ledge, the third-floor window, and the absence of a fully satisfying account of how the description came to be, as specific as it was. The case files that contain Maria's account, Sharp's memoir, the conference presentations, the journal citations, the skeptical analyses, the documentary references, the entries and systematic reviews of veridical NDE claims exist across dozens of libraries, databases, and personal archives in a state of permanent accessibility. Anyone who wants to examine the case can find Sharp's description of the shoe. Anyone who wants to examine the skeptical analysis can find Augustine's critique, Blackmore's arguments, Holden's careful review of the limitations. The record is open in the most literal sense. It is publicly available, widely distributed, and has been for decades. What the record cannot provide is the one thing the question requires: contemporaneous documentation of what Maria described, in the moment she described it, before Sharp had gone to the window, before the shoe had been retrieved, before the account had been told and retold across the long years between 1977 and 1994. That document does not exist. It was never made, and without it, the case rests on the memory of a careful person and the specificity of a description that matched a shoe on a ledge, and the quiet impossibility of knowing now how those two things came to align as precisely as they did. The world that contained the case in 1977, the Seattle of steep hills and gray water and public hospitals on elevated terrain above the downtown streets is still substantially there. First Hill still rises above the downtown core. Harborview still stands at its position above the city. The Pacific Northwest sky still presses down in the same characteristic way over Elliott Bay. On overcast afternoons, the light flat and even and without strong shadows, the kind of light that makes exterior surfaces look the same color for most of the day. The ledge on the north face of the building still catches that light in exactly the way it did when a dark tennis shoe was resting on it, worn at the little toe, lace folded under the heel. The city has changed considerably in the decades since 1977. It is larger now, denser. The economic character of its neighborhoods altered, but the physical geography that places Harborview on its hill above the Sound is unchanged. The terrain is the same. The building is the same in its essential dimensions. The question it holds is the same. Maria's name has traveled through 47 years of research literature, documentary production, conference presentation, and online discussion without her. It has been cited in papers she has almost certainly never read, in languages she may not speak, by researchers who know nothing about her beyond what Sharp recorded in a memoir she may never have seen. The account she gave in a hospital room in Seattle in 1977 has become one of the most frequently cited examples in a literature she had no reason to anticipate, produced by a field that did not yet have its modern form when she described the shoe. Her specific, careful, unhurried description of a worn left tennis shoe on a narrow concrete ledge has outlasted the world that produced it in almost every sense. The immediate social world of Harborview in 1977, the specific network of relationships that connected Maria to Sharp and Sharp to the conference rooms of the early near-death research community, the moment itself, which is gone and cannot be recovered. What survives is the description. What persists is the question it contains. The case file is never formally closed. This is not because anyone has decided to keep it open, or because any institution maintains it as an active investigation. It is simply that the mechanism for closing it, a definitive answer, supported by the contemporaneous documentation that was never made, does not exist and cannot now be created. The file sits in the literature the way unresolved cases sit, accessible, thoroughly analyzed, its limitations precisely described, its central question intact. Researchers cite it,